So one thing I find very unique in Japan about this public discourse on COVID-19 pandemic is that there's almost no mention of individual freedom in adapting to this situation. Of course, there are arguments about economic impacts. Small businesses losing their jobs and revenues and so on. But as far as I can see, in the media and on social network, I don't see much discussions about the fundamental question individual freedom, whether the government is entitled to restrict individual freedom, and if they can do, on what grounds. I don't see this kind of argument going on much in Japanese social media. And in the United States, for example, there are fundamentalist people who say that the government really cannot restrict individual freedom, so that people are free to do whatever they want at their own risk, and the government cannot simply lock down people's activities. We see these people, many of them actually supporters of Mr. Trump, and we see that happening in the US and in the UK. People are really resentful when those in high position in government take liberties in their individual activities while imposing really stringent, constraints on civil life. And this resentment among the UK people on government ministers who take liberties while imposing strict restrictions. This I also don't see in Japanese media. So I think this is a really interesting observation because probably it might be related to what people term as the difference between East and West. I don't personally subscribe to this simplistic idea that the West is individualistic and the East is kind of totalitarian. I don't subscribe to that philosophy, but I do see this lack of arguments about the fundamental question of individual freedom and government regulations. I don't see that happening so much in Japan. What I do see in Japanese, media is this, reflection on how the COVID-19 measures affecting economy as matters of practical input, but not as matters that touches on the fundamental nature of humanity. So I do think that there's this predominance of practical considerations in assessing government measures in the wake of pandemic, and I see that's probably in contrast to what's happening in the US and in the UK. This would be the most salient, one of the most salient features of what's being discussed in Japan. And I do see this as a really interesting difference between cultures. I'm not saying that any specific culture is excellent, and I'm not saying that, and I'm just making this observation of difference, and which, as somebody who is probably not so typical in Japanese society, I find it very interesting actually. And these are, I think, food for thoughts, because I think this pandemic crisis is a great opportunity to think about these fundamental questions.